Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Natalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. Welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma, and thank you for joining us today. The 10th of September is World Suicide Prevention Day, a crucial moment each year to reinforce one essential truth. Suicide is preventable, and by reshaping our narrative around it, we can foster empathy, hope, and connection. So why is this topic so important for me? So those of you listening who have been listening to other episodes, namely episode 12 and 44, where I share my story, and episode 104, where I specifically talk about loss and Mother's Day, they know, or you know, that my mother died from suicide following years of suffering from depression. So her death 13 and a half years ago deeply impacted me, as you can imagine. I actually still remember the exact moment my father told me about her death. He was sitting where I am sitting now, looking into the video camera that I'm looking at now. And he told me, "You've got to be strong now." And I clearly remember the gasp of air and the guttural scream that exited my lungs as he said those words, because I knew what they meant at the time with the things that happened around that time. This wasn't her first time that she tried to die. And for many years, I had been one of the people she spoke to about her feelings, her challenges, and her suicidal thoughts. She made previous attempts, which ended her in hospital stays and at the clinic. It also ended her feeling hopelessness when she told me things like, "I wasn't even able to go through with it," or "This didn't work either." I could feel her desperation, yet all that I was able to do for her wasn't enough to help her with her emotional turmoil. She had psychological support, but somehow whatever she was dealing with and who she spoke to and what she was able to say didn't prevent her from dying. After she had died, I searched and searched for answers, wishing I would find a note among her things, letting me in a little bit more into what tormented her soul. So yes, this topic is at the core of my being, sort of intertwined with my family's history. As mentioned, you can find more details about how that impacted me in the before mentioned episodes, which you can also find linked in the show notes. There are also other episodes on the podcast which cover the topic, which, for example, is episode 110, where I speak with Richard Blake, who's talking about his suicidal ideation. Another episode is 108, where I speak with Teresa Bruno, who lost her husband through suicide. Then Emma Pearson in 71 also lost her husband through suicide. And then in 55, Emma Payne also lost her partner through suicide and her daughter. So what is suicide and why do people do it? So suicide is an act of intentionally ending one's own life. So death is caused by self-inflicted harm with the intent to die. A non-fatal action with intent is considered a suicide attempt. The other day, we had an accident here on the rail on the train line, actually just very close to where we live. And what they usually say when someone dies on the tracks is called a person accident. And me and my daughter were on the way back from the city, and we had to walk the last station because there were no trains running. And she walked past what she described to me as the tent. And she said to me, or she asked me, "Mommy, why do people do that?" So, suicide is rarely a result of a single event. It usually comes from a complex mix of factors, like, for example, mental illness, like in my mother's case, depression, but also anxiety or bipolar disorder. But it can also stem from, or the effect after, trauma, hopelessness, substance abuse, discrimination, financial hardship, or a perceived loss of belonging. So often people see no other way to end their unbearable pain. We no longer say commit suicide. The word commit is tied to a crime or sin, like committing murder or committing adultery, and suicide is not a crime. It is a health and social issue. So instead of it, we say died by suicide, took their own life, or ended their life. Because it's important, language matters, because using compassionate, non-stigmatizing language helps reduce shame and encourages people at risk and their families to seek help. As part of this podcast, I wanted to actually know how many people are affected by suicide globally. And so the number is at 720,000 people who die by suicide annually, making it the third leading cause of death, especially among the 15 to 29-year-old, which is staggering to me. It is also interesting to note that in 2023 in the US, the male suicide rate was nearly 4 times higher than females. And so globally, men die by suicide so much more than women, though women attempt suicide more often. In the US, male suicide rates peak in those 75 plus, while female peak is around 45 to 64. What I also know since actually before my mother died from suicide is that in terms of the family history, if someone has died by suicide, the siblings or the children of the person who died, their risk increases twofold or threefold for women. And in England and Wales, LGBT plus adults face over twice the risk of suicide compared to heterosexuals. Or Black LGBT individuals face almost 5 times higher risk of suicide. So who is affected and why? Because there are population at risk and there are underlying factors which we're going to look at, because suicide doesn't discriminate. It can be anyone. But research shows that some groups, they carry a higher risk due to social, biological, cultural, or systemic factors. As mentioned before, men are consistently more likely to die by suicide, often because they use more lethal methods and face cultural norms that discourage seeking help. And as I mentioned also before, older men, 75 plus, have the highest suicide rates in many countries. So factors include loneliness, loss of partner, chronic illness, and a sense of purposelessness. In young people, globally, as I said, suicide is the third leading cause of death among the 15 to 29-year-olds. And the reasons are stressors like bullying, academic pressure, identity struggles, family conflicts, social media comparison, and lack of coping skills. Many young people struggle silently because of stigma, fear of judgment, and lack of access to youth-friendly mental health services. But also people with mental health or substance use disorders are more at risk. So for example, conditions like depression, bipolar disorder, PTSD, borderline personality disorder, or schizophrenia increase vulnerability. Also, substance misuse, alcohol, drugs, for example, can both worsen mental health symptoms and lower impulse control. Then LGBTQ+ individuals face higher risk due to discrimination, rejection by family, identity-related traumas, and social isolation. In some places, the LGBTQ+ youth are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than their non-LGBTQ peers. So where acceptance is higher and or legal protections are stronger, suicide risk decreases significantly. Also, indigenous and marginalized populations like refugees, migrants, racial and ethnic minorities often face systemic oppression, intergenerational trauma, and barriers to care. So, for example, suicide rates in some indigenous communities are 2 to 4 times higher than national averages. And the root causes include colonization, loss of cultural identity, poverty, and or a lack of access to culturally safe mental health services. Then people in conflict, crisis, or poverty, such as war, displacement, unemployment, financial insecurities, and food scarcity, are also at a heightened risk. Or those living through humanitarian crises like natural disasters, pandemics, armed conflict, that can trigger hopelessness and trauma. And as mentioned before, families with a history of suicide. So if suicide occurs in the family, surviving relatives face increased vulnerability both biologically, so a genetic predisposition, as well as psychological grief, trauma modeling of the behavior. So support for these families are critical, as silence and shame may stop them from seeking help. So this matters because suicide risk is shaped by both personal pain and social conditions. So understanding who is most vulnerable reminds us that prevention isn't just about individuals. It's also about building caring, supportive, and equitable communities. So what might be the common warning signs to recognize? Because spotting those signs in someone you care about can actually help prevent a suicide. So it could be expressing hopelessness, being a burden, or having no reason to live. My mother named all of those that I just mentioned. Another sign could be withdrawing from social life or daily activities, drastic mood swings, but also sudden calmness after depression, talking about death or wanting to die, increased substance use, aggression or risky behaviors, but also behavior changes like giving away possessions, making final arrangements. My mother spoke to me about wanting to die. In retrospect, we think that she made final arrangements such as saying goodbye to friends. But obviously in hindsight, you can see those things through a different lens. The night before she died, we had a conversation and we spoke to each other. So, it's very difficult for me to think about whether there were warning signs that I overlooked. Yeah. So let's have a look at some of the misconceptions about suicide. Because breaking those myths is really helping people to understand that it's not just a phase, but it's a real issue. So first myth is talking about suicide plans, the idea. So this is harmful because many people avoid the topic for fear of putting ideas in someone's head. But this silence actually reinforces stigma and leaves people suffering alone. I did a suicide prevention workshop, and one of the parts of that was to be able to say the words like, are you planning to die by suicide? Are you planning to harm yourself? What is the plan? What have you already purchased? To really name those things and not shy away from talking about it. Because the reality is asking directly and compassionately about suicidal thoughts does not encourage suicide. It opens the door to support and shows you care. And I like to end this first myth with a hope perspective. Conversations save lives. Talking openly about suicide creates safety and connection. The second myth is only people with mental illness die by suicide. This is harmful because it oversimplifies the issue and stigmatizes those with mental illnesses, while overlooking social, cultural, and economic factors. Because the reality is that mental illness is a factor, is a risk factor, but people may also die by suicide due to trauma, isolation, loss, discrimination, financial hardship, or a sudden life crisis. And to end with the hope perspective, understanding suicide as multi-layered helps us see more pathways for prevention and support. The third myth is those who talk about it won't do it. This is harmful because dismissing someone's word as attention-seeking increases their sense of isolation and hopelessness. So the reality is that most people who die by suicide gave verbal or behavioral warning signs beforehand. So every mention of suicide should be taken seriously. And so to end with the hope perspective is that if someone speaks about suicide, it's a cry for help and a chance to step in with care. The fourth myth is once someone tries, they'll try again. So this is harmful because this belief creates hopelessness and discourages offering help and reinforces the idea that recovery is impossible. The reality is that a past attempt is a strong risk factor, but it is not a destiny. So with support, therapy, safety planning, and community, many never attempt again. Survivors often find new meaning and even become advocates for others. So the whole perspective here is every attempt survived is a second chance. So intervention can turn crisis into recovery. And one that I hear often is number 5, suicide is a selfish act. And this is really harmful because it blames the person and deepens the shame for the loved ones. Because the reality is most people who die by suicide feel like a burden and believe their death will relieve others. It comes from unbearable pain, not selfishness. So my mother clearly spoke those words. She said, after one of her attempts, when I had a conversation with her because I was 19 weeks pregnant at the time and I was really angry at her attempting suicide, she said, you know, I'm just a burden for everyone around me. It would be easier without me. So it would be a relief if I was gone. Now, at the time, I couldn't understand and I was angry. But yes, that was her absolute belief. So the whole perspective here is suicide is not about selfishness. It's about suffering. So compassion can shift the story from blame to care. So the 6th myth is if someone looks happy again, the danger is gone. So this is really harmful because loved ones may miss danger signs if they assume improvement means safety. The reality is that sometimes people appear calm after deciding to end their life. It may signal a risk, not necessarily recovery. Actually, in terms of the suicide prevention work I mentioned, is that the time before the suicide, so there's a dip in let's say depression or the feelings of hopelessness, and there's a calmness before the decision. And if a person actually connects with someone else in that time, there's a real chance for them to get over this dip, this assumed calm, and to get out of this. So the whole perspective here is genuine healing takes time. So staying connected, even when someone seems fine, can be life-saving. The 7th myth is children don't die by suicide. This is harmful because this belief prevents parents, teachers, and caregivers from recognizing risk in children and teens. Because the reality is, sadly, even young children can experience suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And rates increase in adolescence, but risk can appear earlier. So the whole perspective is talking about emotions, teaching coping skills, and offering safe spaces can protect young lives. And the last myth here, number 8, is suicide is inevitable if someone is determined. So this is harmful if it creates fatalism, the idea that nothing can help, so why bother trying? Because the reality is that most suicidal crises are temporary. With timely intervention, restricted access to means and emotional support, lives can be saved. And the whole perspective here is suicide is preventable. So compassion, listening, and professional help can truly change outcomes. Let's have a look at some of the cultural perspectives on suicide. So suicide is a global phenomenon, but how it is understood, reported, and addressed varies widely depending on cultural, religious, and societal beliefs. These differences influence both the rate of suicide and how communities respond to it. So in many cultures, suicide is heavily stigmatized or even criminalized. Some countries list suicide as a crime in law, which discourages families from reporting death honestly and prevents individuals from seeking help. Religious beliefs may label suicide as a sin, intensifying shame for families, and obviously silencing the survivors of a suicide loss in their family. This also leads to underreporting, so the numbers, as we heard them at the beginning, might actually be higher because, as I mentioned, the families are discouraged from reporting because of the law of their region. In Western countries, men are more likely to die by suicide, often linked to expectations of masculinity, also reluctance to seek help, and they use, as I mentioned, more lethal methods. In China and rural Asia, historically women had higher suicide rates than men, often tied to gender inequity, domestic abuse, and the lack of social power or options. In recent years, however, urbanization and social changes have shifted these patterns, but rural areas are still reporting higher female vulnerability to suicide. Countries like Lithuania or Belarus have some of the highest suicide rates in the world, which is linked to economic hardship, alcohol misuse, and limited access to mental health. Japan and South Korea, they face cultural pressures of perfectionism, academic and work demands, and social expectation contributing to elevated suicide rates despite strong economies. Also, religion and spirituality plays a role. For example, Catholic majority countries, so parts of Latin America, for example, historically condemned suicide strongly, which also reduced reporting and increased stigma, but also acted as a deterrent for some. Whereas Hindu and Buddhist traditions frame suffering and karma differently, influencing how suicide is discussed and understood, though stigma persists. In Islamic context, suicide is forbidden, which both discourages the act and fuels secrecy when it happens. Then some of the indigenous and traditional perspectives, so many indigenous communities view suicide within the context of colonial trauma, loss of land, and cultural disconnection, rather than individual pathology. So healing practices may involve restoring cultural identity, community belonging, and spiritual connection. Also, the cultural impact on help seeking. So, for example, in cultures where emotional expression is discouraged, people may suppress distress and avoid therapy. Where in collectivist societies, family and communities play a stronger role, which can either act as a protective factor, like a strong support system, or a risk factor, for example, when there's shame or fear of dishonoring the family. So where cultural embrace, openness, and community care, suicide prevention efforts are more effective. So the key takeaway here is that suicide cannot be understood outside of its cultural context. So how societies talk about suicide, whether they stigmatize or normalize help seeking, and the availability of culturally sensitive support systems all shape the risk and the pathways of or to prevention. So what helps those at risk? Or what do they need? So suicidal thoughts often come from a place of deep isolation and hopelessness. What people at risk need most is to feel that they are not alone, and that there are real pathways out of the pain they're experiencing. What can help is compassionate listening and validation. So people thinking about suicide often feel unseen, unheard, or dismissed. When you offer a non-judgmental presence, just listening without trying to fix immediately, it can provide profound relief. Like phrases like, "I'm here with you," or "your feelings make sense given what you're going through," help someone feel valued or less isolated. Access to professional help, such as therapy, psychiatry, and crisis intervention, provide tools and treatments that save lives. And there's also crisis lines and text lines. For example, 988 in the US, Samaritans in the UK, or local equivalents. And they offer immediate support when someone feels unsafe with their own thoughts. So for some, medication or inpatient care may be essential. For others, counseling or peer support groups are enough to stabilize hope. Supportive environment, so being part of a caring community, whether it's family, friends, a peer network, or even online group, reduces risk significantly. Also, workplaces and schools can be protective if they create spaces where people feel safe to speak about mental health struggles without judgment or repercussions. Safety planning. So developing a safety plan is one of the most effective suicide prevention strategies. It usually includes recognizing warning signs, identifying coping strategies, listing supportive contacts and crisis lines, reducing access to lethal means such as firearms, medication, or harmful environments. A safety plan turns a moment of crisis into a chance for survival. As a therapist, I have a safety plan with clients who have suicidal ideation, where we agree that they will call me before they act on their thoughts. I had the safety plan in effect with my mother. It's not a fail-safe means, but it can help someone discuss and go through this step before they act on their thoughts. On a larger scale, suicide prevention needs collective actions. So, adequate funding for mental health services, stigma reduction, campaigns that normalize asking for help, early intervention in programs in school where many struggles begin, workplace mental health policies that support stress management and crisis response. So countries that invest in these areas see suicide rates decrease. So it's proof that prevention is possible. So a sense of hope and purpose above all is that those at risk need to know that their life matters. So small acts of kindness, opportunities to contribute, reconnecting with passions, or finding meaning in relationships and community can spark a return of hope. Prevention isn't only about stopping death. It's about rebuilding reasons to live. So the key takeaway for you here is that what saves lives is not one single intervention, but a combination of care, connection, and systemic support. Each of us can play a role by listening, by guiding towards resources, by creating supportive environments, and by advocating for a culture where no one has to face despair alone. So as mentioned in the beginning, today marks World Suicide Prevention Day. And so there's many communities around the world who do something specific on that day. And I've collected a few. I will link those in the show notes. A couple of them in India, in Kerala, there are programs that help. The day is like featured by a bike rally, a flash mob, and a sign like that says a sign into life, like a signature campaign encouraging collective pledge towards suicide prevention. In the United Kingdom, there's the Wigan Warriors Rugby League Club that opened a community garden at Robin Park Arena to memorialize a former player called Terry Newton who died by suicide in 2010. And this garden serves as a safe haven with a wall of hope where players, fans, and the public share messages of support and remembrance. Then in Texas, in Laredo in the United States, the Dough for Hope event is connected with Pizza for Purpose. So guests enjoy pizza at the local pizzeria while accessing mental health resources and support. So this is organized by Laredo Public Health Department. And this event reflected an ongoing community outreach aligned with the 2025 theme. Then in Toowoomba in Queensland, Australia, Lifeline Darling Downs hosts an inaugural Out of the Shadows walk and participants walking in 9 symbolic laps to represent the 9 lives lost daily to suicide in Australia. As mentioned, I will link those places where this has been reported. So why these examples matters? These stories span continents but share a common thread. They showcase creative, community-driven approaches to suicide prevention. So like from public pledges and memorial gardens to mobile support and symbolic walks, each transforms the theme, changing the narrative of suicide, which is this year's theme, into meaningful action. So, to end today's podcast episode, changing the narrative begins with a conversation. And so your voice matters. Today and every day, let's create space for empathy, understanding, and support. Because you never know whose life you might change. If you are needing support, feel free to check in, to send a message to info@nataliehimmelrich.com or send us a message. In the show note there's a link to send a message. Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to our newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.